on a historical sense for the argument of Jesus' empty tomb.
Yes.
How do historians argue that it wasn't empty just because someone did move the body? Like
Because
how,
someone what?
like one of the disciples moved the body to another place.
Notice that there are two steps in an argument for the resurrection of Jesus. The first one is the inductive step, where you assemble the data to be explained. And I think the empty tomb is one of those data, and most historians agree with that. The other question is, how do you best explain it? And as I said, there have been lots of alternative theories, like the conspiracy theory, the apparent death theory, hallucination theory, and so forth. And I think one of the many problems with the theft hypothesis is that it's completely anachronistic. It looks at the situation of the disciples through the rear view mirror of Christian history. We look back on these events in retrospect of a church that believes that Jesus is risen from the dead. But you've got to put yourself in the shoes of a first century Palestinian Jew confronted with the crucifixion and ask what he would have thought and done. And as I indicated, Jewish messianic expectations had absolutely no concept of a Messiah who would be executed and defeated by his enemies. Messiah, when he came, was supposed to cast off the enemies of Israel and to reestablish the throne of David in Jerusalem, and all the nations would come and pay homage to him and respect him. The idea of a Messiah who failed to deliver and to reign, still being Messiah, was just a contradiction in terms. It was an oxymoron for a first century Jew. So as N.T. Wright said, if you're a first century follower of one of these messianic movements, and your favorite Messiah got himself crucified, he said you basically had two choices. Either you went home, or you got yourself a new Messiah. But in no case, right across the first century, prior to Christ or the century following Christ, do we find any proponents of these failed messianic movements saying, he is the Messiah after all because he's risen from the dead. That isn't the way a first century Jew thinks. Second point that I also mentioned in the talk is the idea of resurrection from the dead in Judaism just has no connection whatsoever with Messiah. There's unconnected ideas. And moreover, the resurrection never occurs until the end of the world. It's never of an isolated individual. It's always of all the people corporately to be judged by God after God brings about the end of the world. So for a first century Jew living in Palestine at that time, it would be simply out of the question to think of stealing the body and saying he was risen from the dead, because that just is completely at odds with Jewish categories. What a first century Jew who was still devoted to Jesus would have done would be to have preserved the tomb of Jesus as a shrine where his bones would be preserved in an ossuary until the resurrection at the end of the world, when they and Jesus could be reunited in the kingdom of God. But they wouldn't have come to believe this or try to conspire together and make a conspiracy to say that he was already risen from the dead and therefore was the Messiah. After all, that's just not the way a first century Jew thinks, or that first century people would have